It's 4 o'clock on the dot. Let's get started. I really value your time, and I'm so glad that you're with me today. If anyone doesn't know me, I'm Tia Ramey. I am a communication strategist specialized in social media. I've done a lot with crisis communications, and I'm just an educator at heart. I've done a lot of communication trainings, especially recently with some of our leaders. We had with Ohio State University, they did like a public safety leadership academy. It had mayors and township trustees and public figures all over the state, and they took this communication training with me. I usually do this sometimes with political scientists. I've done this at Ohio State as well with their students. And also I've done this training quite a bit with those who are in marketing and communications, but I thought it's a really great time to bring this training and roll it out for just the common public, because understanding this really does impact the way we speak to one another, the way we communicate with one another, but mostly it impacts the way that we're hearing each other out. And I think it's no secret that there's so much bickering going on, and whether you are an employee, an employer, whether you are a parent, a minister, a pastor, a leader, we're all sort of seeing this tension in the way that we're communicating, and things have gotten so different. It's changed so much. And I want to kind of bring you to why that's happening and what's going on, and my own processes for how I've helped to mitigate some of this through my content creation and content marketing efforts and communication strategies that I've used in public service, through outreach initiatives as well, and what has really helped us to communicate some big ideas to people who need to hear what's available to them, and how we've been able to have those conversations that really create the change that counts. So thank you again for joining. I'm going to dive right in, but I do want to just start here with saying that this all came from the inspiration of my book. I used to teach first, and then I wrote my book. It's called Canceled. It's all about mastering difficult conversations. You can purchase this book just about anywhere online. It's available if you go to my website, tiaramey.com. You can also get it on Audible. If you have an Audible subscription, it is an audio book available. But I talk a lot about the strategies that you'll see in this book for, what are these 7 languages that we didn't even know emerged that we weren't paying attention to? What are common communication mistakes that people are making? How do you get around them? So I'll talk about some of this, and if you want to go even deeper, you're more than welcome to dive into my book, but I won't spend too much time talking about that. But one thing I would love for you to just understand here is that what's happening today is, and we've probably noticed this, is that some of our words have evolved, and what we're hearing now are people who are processing words very differently than what they have before. So some words of what they meant in the past do not have the same meaning that they do today. And if you're not paying attention to that, and this happens quite a lot, even just in your personal interactions, people are speaking a different language. And I want to give this example of just some words that sound the same around the world, but they have different meanings in different languages. And this is just happening within our English language in our westernized society. And our relationship with technology has much to do with that. So the case that I want to make today to you is that there are 7 modern languages of social media and just modern society in general. And I want to talk to you about where they've come from, how they have developed, and how do we get around some of it. Now, what I don't want to do, I'm not trying to change the way you think, but I am trying to enhance the way you communicate your ideologies, because I think that we're seeing a lot of tension around having really important conversations. We're actually having more difficult conversations imposed on us than ever before. Thank you, social media, for that, right? And so now that we're forced to have all these difficult conversations, we're not really having them effectively. There's always someone doing a lot of talking and someone that's just expected to shut up and listen. And I want to really help us change how that is happening, so that we are all listening to each other and understanding our intentions, so that we can get our ideas across, which is why I said that this workshop is about how to communicate in a way that inspires change. And if you know how to listen, then you'll know what to say. And so if I'm making the case of where our language comes from, it really does come from everyone's individual identity and their relationship with themselves. Now, on top of that, we add in a few layers there's this thing of duty. We all have these personal duties that we're trying to protect, and survival instincts that's happening at the same time. And what I mean by survival instincts is what happens when someone is hearing difficult information. They immediately have this challenge of whether or not they can survive what you're saying. And temptation is often whether or not I'm going to allow you to change my reality with your words. So do I become defensive? Do I become angry? Do I translate what you're saying and manipulate it in a way that I can hear it? That's what's happening. We're not just learning how to take in what someone is saying, we're automatically trying to figure out how to survive it. And so what I would like for us to learn is, how do we say things in a way that does not trigger someone's survival instincts? Because once they think they have to survive your words, then they put up this big block and it's very hard for you to get through. I mean, just think about some of the bad news that you've received in your life. Just a few words that may have changed something. Maybe you found out that someone had a terminal illness. Your life was totally different on the other side of that conversation. And so people are always trying to figure out, how do I survive this information? But now bad news and difficult conversations has evolved quite a bit. I mean, from race, gender, politics, so many discussions that we were told in the past that we shouldn't have, even religion, we're having it. And every time you have a conversation with a person, you're enhancing their reality a little bit. And they're trying to figure out whether or not they're going to allow you to do that. So these are some micro decisions that are being made in a very short time frame. So moving forward, what I want you to understand is all of these things together: self-identity, relationships, your sense of duty, and your survival instincts all make up what I call the language of the heart. And so we hear a lot about diversity initiatives, but I want to talk to you about diversity in a different way. Diversity is more than just skin and what we look like. It's all about who we are individually. And I would like for us to hear each other through that lens as an individual, one person at a time, and not boxing ourselves or one another into some of the popular boxes that are trending today. So moving forward, really, it's all about getting to know your audience, understanding the language of the heart. Now, whether you're a content creator and you're posting on social media, maybe you are an employer, maybe you are a parent, once you can understand this, you can get through. So I want to just talk to you about what some of those languages are, and I'll break them down to you, and then maybe we can have some dialogue. But these 7 major languages are divided by God language, leadership language, family language, fight language, youth language, hurt language, and patriot language. If I break some of them down, what they mean, those of us who speak the God language, and where this comes from is someone's sense of duty, their higher sense of duty. Now, one thing is interesting is you might speak multiple languages, but most of the time, your deepest sense of duty is going to determine and create what your words are when you react and respond to difficult information. Those people who speak the God language, they may or may not be religious. Sometimes they're very spiritual, and they have a great sense of duty to spirituality, to the earth, to preserving the earth. Sometimes they have a very eternal sense of themselves. One thing that's interesting about this group of people is that they really believe that they are more of spiritual people having a human experience versus a human having a spiritual experience. And so their relationship with time really is going to determine what their language is. And you'll notice that quite a bit, there are some people who only think in smaller increments, and I'll get into some of that later. But this group of people has more of an eternal mindset. And so what is important to them, like I said, maybe it is climate change. That may be a big thing. Maybe it is their religious freedom rights. And so they're going to come at you from that lens. When they're thinking or when they're speaking and when they're talking, they're very concerned about the progression of their life after death. So they speak this God language because of their sense of duty, mostly to a higher power. Now there's the leadership language. Leaders have a deep sense of duty to problem solving. They're a very, very interesting group of people. I think that sometimes they can be the most misunderstood. They're very focused on seeing the bigger picture, so they really don't like you talking to them through tiny little minute details. They kind of want you to get to the point and get to a higher level. So they may be impatient with your process of building up to the details. They are really hearing and listening through how do we solve this problem. That is what they hear when you're talking to them and having a difficult conversation. They're usually immediately calculating that. Also, they have a strong sense of ownership. So when you're talking to a leader, or if you are a leader, maybe some of you are in the audience, when you're talking to a leader, they really do not like hearing blame most of the time. They really want to hear you take ownership. They believe in ownership because that is where their sense of duty lies. Often they can be made up of government leaders, influencers, business leaders, entrepreneurs, and they focus a lot on developing their skills. And so their language comes from this space, and there's nothing you can do to change someone's deep sense of duty. That's very important to them. It's who they are, it's their makeup. Next, we have the family language. And of course, they have a deep sense of duty to family. So these are people who are usually have a language that is geared towards partnership and kinship. These are people who are very community service driven. They're focused on how to protect children and preserving innocence. They think a lot about pooling resources. One thing that's important to note about family language people is that they are not necessarily focused on seeing themselves as individuals. When they see their identity, they are a collective, they are a part of a family. So for them, honor and dignity and representation really matters versus other groups that they only want to be seen as an individual. Our family language people really they really understand their identity as a collective, as a family unit. So honor is a big word for our family language people. And some of you may relate to some of that, but that is their deepest sense of duty. And I'll give you some examples of what that looks like, but they also do not really believe in selfishness. They are people who believe that selfishness is very toxic. And so when you speak to someone who speaks a family language, you want to go away from using a lot of those I sort of things and think about more we's, because that's how they think. Moving forward, we've got a fight language, and it's exactly as it sounds. A lot of our fight language people are our greatest advocates. These are the people who have a strong sense of duty in the pursuit of justice and activism. These are people who are focused on diversity and equity and history. They have a very deep sense of history. And a lot of times, our fight language people may also speak the leadership language. Again, you can speak more than one language. That is very possible. And they identify usually as survivors. Oftentimes they've been through hard things, and so they advocate for others who may be going through those things. And they really focus on equity and equality. So it's very important to them. You'll hear that in their language. Oftentimes our fight language people may hear something that someone may say, and if they feel like it doesn't sound right, then they are not afraid to correct you, because that is their deep sense of duty, is making sure that everyone around them is making the adjustments that need to be made for the sake of the pursuit of justice and equity and equality. So moving forward, we have the youth language. This is probably one of the loudest languages that we see in social media and our entertainment industry. And that being because our youth language have a strong sense of duty to self. They're usually not very aware of how their actions or behaviors are going to impact them over time. Now, I will say that our youth language people are not necessarily reserved to the young. It's really just how they see themselves, okay? So most of the time they're young. Young people don't necessarily understand their decisions over time, or they don't understand how their decisions impact other people. So they have a deep sense of duty to their own personal happiness. That's very important to them. They don't really like to see themselves as an eternal time span or even 100-year time span. A lot of times they may go in 10-year increments. So they're not thinking that far ahead when they're making decisions. And so the choices that you make when you think about 100 years or even eternity is very different than the choices you're going to make when you think about 10 years. I mean, for example, someone who is wealthy and they have to make their money last for several generations is going to do something very different with their money versus someone who is going to try and make their money last for the week or until they get paid again. So it's the same when it comes to time. Remember, in the beginning, our God language people think in eternal sense versus our youth people, they don't really think that long term when they're making choices and when they're developing their language and they're talking about their personal happiness and fulfillment and the things that they're interested in. They're not often going that far ahead or thinking that far ahead about who they are as a whole. So they're coming from a totally different place, a very different position than anyone else. And so they're usually often are innovators, strong in art, technology, science, sexuality, travel, and pop culture. This is our youth language group. And so when you talk to them, this is where they're coming from, and you have to understand that this is their deep sense of duty is to themselves and being true to themselves. And they do not like being identified with other groups the way that our family language people are. So then we have another group, and this is our hurt language. And I think we see a lot of this on social media. These people have a deep sense of duty to protecting their personal pain. And so when you hear people who have or speak a hurt language, they're often cynical, or they could be jealous, they may be sarcastic, they may be angry, they may lack confidence in their language, they might be pessimistic. Our fight language people, again, I say they identify as survivors, versus our hurt language people identify as victims. Now, sometimes these languages can be at war with one another. For example, our hurt language group, they do not often get along with our leadership language group. Remember, our leadership language group is all about personal responsibility, and our hurt language group is different. They feel like they were victims, and so who is responsible is whoever was in charge at the time. So they're going to come from a very different place. Now, oftentimes, it takes the group in the middle, our fight language people, that bridge the gap between our leadership language and our hurt language. So our leaders are sometimes trying to serve the hurt people, but they're just not speaking the right language. Happens all the time, and we need those fight language people to really help with the translation. What's interesting is our fight language in our hurt language can often speak the same language, they sound alike, but our hurt language people are not usually partners in the work with our advocates. It's usually the leaders that are. So again, you can speak multiple languages, but sometimes these languages are at war with one another. Just the same way our family language people are often at war with our youth language people. And sometimes it can take our God language to really help sometimes to fill those gaps. So lastly, we have our Patriot language. And these are people who have a very strong sense of duty to their country. They're very optimistic about their governing authorities. They appreciate learning about their nation's history. They often celebrate national holidays. Usually they're made up of government influencers, soldiers, active community members. And sometimes they're not often as well traveled or cultured sometimes as those who speak our fight language or even our youth language. So it's not always true, but I think that our patriots also can be sometimes misunderstood, but that is just the lens they see life through and how they feel about their governing authorities or their country until their own rights sometimes are often being threatened. And then we see them speak a different language, which is often sounds like the fight language. So these are the 7 languages, the 7 modern languages that you see on social media. And I say that whenever you're posting content, or maybe you see someone post something and you're tempted to respond to it, really try to understand what language they're coming from first. Even when you're having these tough discussions, what language they're speaking. And that will really help you. So how do you know how to identify? And I'm going to give you a really quick trick on how I know which language someone speaks. I often go on how they introduce themselves for the most part. So usually our God language people will say, and this is why I say your self-identity has everything to do with it. Your God language people are usually always going to respond with their faith or their spirituality. I might say, hey, my name is Tia Ramey. I'm a God-fearing Christian, you know, and I love yoga or whatever the case may be. They're usually going to talk to you about that. I'm an environmental enthusiast and I really care about climate change. Usually our God language people are going to talk to you about their faith. Our leadership language people are always going to introduce themselves with telling you what their occupation is, because no one says, you know, hey, my name is Tia Ramey and I scoop poop. They don't say that. But I would say I'm a senior vice president and chief digital strategist. They always lead with their occupation. And that's usually how I know that they are a leader. Our family language people are usually always going to introduce themselves talking about their position in the family. My name is Tia Ramey. I am a wife and a mother of one little girl, and so on and so forth. So it's a dead giveaway. Let them introduce themselves. They will tell you exactly which language they speak by what they say. Our fight language people usually talk to you about their passions and their volunteer activities. Our youth language people are usually always leading with their interests and hobbies, the things that are fun to them. Our hurt language people usually kind of introduce themselves talking about some of the things they're entertained by. So for example, they may say, you know, hey, my name is Tia and I love Star Wars. You know, most of the time they're going to give you something like that because entertainment is often a distraction for that group. They really don't want to bask in that space. And they like to escape into some realms of fantasy or the things that they're entertained by. They may tell you, you know, hey, my name is Tia and I'm a Beyonce fan or whatever. And then our patriots are always usually going to tell you about their occupation as well and their love for their country. And so these are the trigger words that you listen for when you talk to another person to find out what language they speak. And I'm saying you want to know that because you want to be able to adjust your ear now according to what they say. And this protects you from getting offended or even taking them the wrong way. So moving forward, each of these 7 languages all have kingdoms, I like to call communities that they belong to. There are plenty of them. We see all of these different groups on social media, and it's very interesting to watch. So if you go into them and you pay attention to their languages, like I said, a lot of times for example, our feminist community, they speak a lot of that fight language. A lot of our Republicans speak the Patriot language quite a bit, right? And so think about that. They all have a different language. And sometimes we see people say things and we get so offended and we forget. They may not be speaking, one, they're not talking to you directly. And then 2, they're not talking in your language, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. So sometimes we're thinking that everything is the difference between what's right and what's wrong. And sometimes it's not the difference between right and wrong. Sometimes it's the difference between French and Spanish. And that's what we're not paying attention to. We assume that because we're all speaking English, that words mean the same way to me that it does to you. And it doesn't anymore. That has all changed. So I want to move into a little bit of this. Let's see, someone had a question. Would it matter what the environment was during the discussion? I believe that absolutely does matter. And thank you so much for your question. It does matter. And again, like I said, what you may be doing online, even like, for example, at work, you may not have some of these discussions at work. I think that you really do need to set an environment and set expectations up front of what your objective is when you talk to a person and have those difficult conversations where you are expecting to inspire change in another individual. And I'll get into some of that just a little bit later. Thank you again for your question. But I just want to address why this is important for you to know. And I'm going to bring up a conversation that I think that a lot of us may have been privy to. So we saw this discussion with Mikaya Bryant, and I watched all the comments on social media, and I listened to what everyone had to say about her situation. And literally everyone had such a different side of this story and a different piece of this puzzle. So I want to talk just a little bit about how each of these languages saw that issue and where we came to each other with. So for example, a lot of our God language people saw that the society and conditioning was part of the problem. Because again, our God language people are usually really focused on the bigger picture here. Then our leadership language, they thought that policy, they wanted to look at what are the policies around this? What are the policies around foster care? Who's being held accountable for what happened to this young child? The fight language people, they all thought about the police and the governing authorities of how they have failed her. Our youth language people thought that all leaders, parents, and community failed her. We saw that the hurt language usually is just upset with whoever's in charge, and that could be valid. Also, our patriot language, they thought the police were actually the heroes in this situation, and that was their perspective. And then we saw the family language people who really felt like, wow, the family really felt this person. And so what's interesting is that everyone had a perspective of who should have done better, who was the villain, who was the hero. And the facts is that if anyone would have done just a little bit better, whether it was her family, whether it was her foster family, whether it was better policies around foster care, whether it was even a different sort of police training, perhaps. perhaps just one or everyone doing a little bit better could have saved her life. And so what I'd like for us to understand when we talk about who is right and who is wrong is that everyone thinks they're right. There's literally no one. I did this exact same class with a group of political science majors, and I asked them, how many of you think that you are right about your worldview? Everyone thinks they're right, right? But guess what? In our way, everyone is, according to our sense of duty and who we are assigned and who is important to us to hold accountable, who it is that we believe that we ought to protect. So what I try to tell people is very important that we're all humble and that we have to understand that each of us have a piece of this puzzle. And there are going to be times that our puzzle pieces don't connect, right? If you've ever done a 1,000 piece puzzle, you know that there are 998 other pieces or less that do not connect to a particular piece. We all know that. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't make up a part of the puzzle. It's a very important part, because if even just one piece is missing, then we don't get the full picture. So it's okay if your puzzle piece doesn't connect to another. We don't have to insult each other. We don't have to berate each other. We don't have to belittle one another. It just means that they make up a different piece of this puzzle. We need our family language people to hold families accountable. We need our God language people to hold our religious community and our sacred sectors accountable. We need our fight language people to hold our leaders accountable. We need our patriots to hold our government accountable. We need every single person to push just to save and protect one life. And when you think about all of those things, just what it takes to save one life, it matters. And it's great that we have these discussions, but we have got to learn how to have them, not trying to be right, but trying to put together a 1,000 piece puzzle, because it's more complex than who is right and who is wrong. And we're very focused on that, so much so that we're not paying attention to where each other are coming from. So if someone said the family should have done better, you're right. Now let's have that discussion. And if someone says that the police could have done better, let's have that discussion too. It's all worth having. So just moving forward, I want you to understand how people process information. Aside from languages, everyone has the starting point for processing information that they move through. And what I like to say is that in this, if you can get through all of these pieces, then what you get is the truth. So some people process information based on, we all process information based on what gives us comfort. So when you're taking in difficult information and you're hearing something really difficult for the first time, you have this place where you may be logical, emotional, or spiritual. And you're going to start there because that's the place that gives you comfort to survive that difficult information at the time. So let's just talk about logical. A lot of times there are people who are logical or very factual driven. So let's just say there's an example of a police officer that shoots an unarmed Black man. Our logical people are usually going to ask a lot of questions before they decide to take a stance. That's who they are. And some people get really irritated with our logical people. They want to know all the facts. They're very data driven. That's just how they think. And what they're doing is they're trying to protect themselves from having unnecessary feelings. That's usually what they're doing. Remember what I said in the beginning, this is all about survival instincts. So what do they need to survive? They're going to start there. So when you hear someone that's logical, if you tell them something difficult, they're going to ask questions. They want to know who, what, when, where, how. And they're analytical in that way. And they're going to analyze the data and they're going to craft their response based on their process of gathering the facts. So don't be mad at them. Be patient with them. That's just who they are. Let them go on their journey and their path to figuring out how to get to the truth. Now, our emotional people are usually going to be very expressive when they're taking in difficult information. So most of the time, they need to alleviate themselves. Our logical people are trying to keep themselves from feeling, but our more emotional people are usually going to express themselves to relieve themselves of that information as they're taking information in. So they'll react to the information that they have. It doesn't mean that they're not logical. It just means that they are feeling it. So they might be, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry to hear that. They're they're going to listen in. They're going to feel one way or another, and they got to express it, and they have to let it out. And you can't be mad at them. That's their process. Okay, so just let them have their process. If they're emotional, they're connected to that human element of it all, and they got to feel. They may feel immediately angry. They may feel immediately sad. Whatever it is, they've got to express it. And then our spiritual people are very focused on prevention. So they are focused on what is the moral of the story? What could we have learned from this? And usually their process of taking in information, they kind of want to know everything. They want to know the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's use the same example of an officer-involved shooting with an unarmed Black man who lost his life. Our spiritual people want to know, what neighborhood was this in? What were they wearing? What were they doing? Why were they there? And it's not because they don't care. They're just trying to think in their minds like, oh my gosh, what could have prevented this? And so sometimes we misunderstand them because it can sound like they're assigning blame. And we have to be very careful about that in our process of, if you are that spiritual thinker and you're thinking about prevention, they're just thinking, what could I have learned from this story that I could apply to my own life? And that's just how they think. Now, hopefully, if you are, one of those people that you start on either of those planes, the idea is to go on that journey of all three. So our logical people, they focus on the facts. Our emotional people, they focus on their feelings. And then we have our spiritual people who focus on what does this mean? And if you can put all three of those pieces together, you have a beautiful balanced conversation where you can move through the information, because our meaning and feeling deal with the why, but the facts deal with the what, right? And so we have to know why. These things are very important. We have to know what it was. We've got to know why it is too. So you can't stop at just being logical. You can't just be emotional, and you can't just be spiritual, because without the facts and the feelings, there's no meaning at all. So if you can go down this entire journey, I'd call you hit this home run, and it gives you the path to truth. Because at the end of the day, the reason why we should be having these meaningful discussions, this is our journey to figuring out what the truth is. And this could be just a conversation between a husband or a wife. There's going to be that part where you're discussing the facts. There's going to be an exchange of emotion. And now you've got to define this conversation so you can get to the truth. Do not throw any of it out. And it takes time. And we do have to be very patient with each other in this process. It's very important. But we have to know, like, oh my gosh, we're spending too much time on our feelings. How do we move this along? This gives you a bit of a diagram for what you should be progressing through so you can have an honest discussion. So what we're really talking about today is, how do we expand our capacity for honest dialogue? Can you take it in? And can you also be responsible with dishing that truthful information back out? And it's very important to know. So really start to see your conversations from that lens. And if you find yourself circling in one area, figure out how you can progress it. Like, you know what, we're spending too much time here. And really get that home run going for yourselves. And it'll help you out quite a bit to progress it. So there's someone, Ben Shapiro, he always says this thing that says, facts don't care about your feelings. And that's true. Facts do not care about your feelings, but the truth cares about your feelings. It's an important part of it. It's not the only part. And that's another thing a lot of our young people have to learn now, is that our feelings is not the only part that matters. We have to discuss all of it. We can't leave anything out, right? So we have to figure out what is the truth. And this is the thing that is rarely discussed. I don't think that we probably talk about this or define what truth is enough, because we've now made truth to be subjective instead of objective. And one thing I like to say about truth is that it is consistency. So truth should be able to go through all these threads. It should be able to go through time. It should be able to go through perspectives. It should be able to go through everything and still make sense. So if we are truly all putting our pieces together, truth should be able to go through facts, feelings, emotions. And once we can find what is consistent in all of those stories, then we have the truth. Time doesn't change what is true. The only thing that changes are opinions. But truth doesn't actually really truly change, right? I'm Tiara Ramey, today, yesterday, forever. This is me. That doesn't change. And so we have got to understand what is consistent. And what we've been doing lately in our conversations is we like to throw out anything that isn't consistent with our ideology. And that's not the best way to go on a truth discovery. We're putting our pieces together here. That's what we're doing. So instead of trying to take the approach of who is right and who is wrong, let's take the approach of this is my perspective. What is yours? Let's put this together so we can figure out what the real truth is and how we move forward. So this is a big quote from my book. When you have an ear for the truth, you do not want people around you to say what you need to hear. You learn how to hear what needs to be said. This is what's very important. And I want to spend more time with our college students on this because I don't think they're being trained in this enough. But you have to learn how to hear the truth. It doesn't mean that we're all manipulating one another. And I've talked to this about in just languages of just understanding we're speaking a different language here, and that's okay. But we shouldn't be manipulating information. And I think we're seeing too much of that, even in our media. We've got all these sort of different objectives in our media outlets. There's conservative media and there's liberal media, and that's not their job, is to figure out what facts they want to present to you so that they're speaking your language. That's what's manipulation, really, truly. But this is why we have to do our own research, and this is why we have to be able to have difficult conversations right now and sit down with people who think differently than us so we can all put these pieces together and move dialogue forward. So this is an illustration of molting. And this is what happens when a bug has outgrown its skin. We do this thing when we are in the process of listening. We're transforming. Every conversation that you have, you're a little bit different. I mean, think of everything that you learn as one opportunity of dialogue to the next, and you've become this compilation of every conversation that you've had over time. And so eventually you're not changing. And sometimes we're so afraid that someone's going to tell us something that we don't want to hear and they're going to change us. We're not changing. You know, we've just outgrown our old skin and that's okay. It's okay to evolve. But there's this thing about this process with bugs is that they have to be perfectly still, and it does make them very vulnerable to predators when they are going through this molting process. You've probably seen like cicadas and their little shells on trees and things like that. So it's the same thing when you are listening to someone and they're telling you something difficult for the first time. You have to learn how to be very still, and that is uncomfortable because it takes vulnerability to listen, but it also takes vulnerability to have honest, true dialogue. It's very important. It's very important that we do this. And so the truth is also just as much about finding yourself as it is about losing yourself. And you've got to be willing to become a new person once you receive new information and you've done the research and you've gone down the journey. So we cannot be afraid that someone is going to change us truly. It's a good thing if once we've put these beautiful pieces together and we found the consistency in the message that we are able to evolve as people together. So I'm just going to move into another segment on preventing crisis in some of this. Again, because I've been a crisis communications professional and I've tracked so many conversations to figure out, you know, what went wrong when someone went out and poured their heart out, I guess. But there's some common speaking mistakes that we often make. One of those speaking mistakes is that, one, we're not really being honest about why we're even talking. And again, I said that the whole purpose of having a conversation is to discover the truth. So if you're not doing that, you're going to create a lot of miscommunication for yourself. So one of those things is called expressive communication. So if you're only talking to express yourself, you can cause a lot of miscommunication. And we've heard this before. And you ever had someone sit down and they start just dumping on you and you offered them a solution and they didn't want it? And so if you are an expressive communicator, you just tell somebody that up front. Hey, you know, I just need to get this off my head. I don't need any advice right now, but I'm looking for a listening ear. Do you mind helping me out? And we don't want to say that because we don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to be rejected, but we're also not being honest, because as soon as someone gives you advice that you don't want and you really just wanted to express yourself and you feel like they're not allowing you to do that, you've created a communication enemy. And it's not really fair to do if you haven't told them what you really want, which means you have to stop and assess what your goal is for this conversation before you even have it. And that's very important. The next thing is seeking consensus. That's a big problem. Sometimes we're only talking because we want someone to agree with us. And so if you're only talking to get agreement, then you need to say that from the beginning. And also make sure that you speak subjectively instead of objectively. For example, if you said that, if you said LeBron James is the greatest ball player in the world, you're going to spark an argument. Some people think it's Michael Jordan. But if you said, some people think LeBron James is the greatest ball player in the world, then they will agree with you because yes, some people do think that way. So you have to also learn how to speak for yourself if you're looking for agreement. People will not often disagree with what the facts are, but they are going to disagree with your translation of those facts. And sometimes we are translating and then we're expecting people to agree with our translation. This is often why biblical discussions and religious discussions can become really contentious very fast, is because really we're translating and we're not necessarily going off of this is what the Bible says. Yes, we can all agree on what the Bible says, but do I agree with your translation of that? So if you need agreement, make sure that you know how to speak for yourself and make sure that you know how to speak the hard facts and plan that before you speak. And lastly, sometimes people are just seeking validation. I call that egocentric communication. And how that looks oftentimes is that someone needs someone to boost the esteem. And if you're talking to me and you need me to help you feel good about yourself, if I don't do that, then I'm a communication enemy, right? And so, for example, I've seen this happen all the time. I've probably done this with my husband 100 times. Babe, how do I look? And he'll say, you look fine. And then I'm mad because he said I look fine after spending 2 hours getting ready. Because the word fine to him means you look great, but the word fine to me is, oh, you look all right. And I don't want to hear that. And then I'm going to go change. And what I really should have said was, babe, I need you to tell me how great I look. And he would have said, you look incredible. And so these are the sort of things that happen all the time. We're not being honest about what we really want, the response we really want, and we're not setting the people we're talking to up for success. And so we create communication enemies because they're not giving us what they want. And it's really because if you're doing any one of these three things, you're not really ready for the truth. If you're only talking to express yourself, you don't really want to hear the truth. You just want to speak what's going through your head. If you are talking just to get agreement, you're not really interested in the truth, or else you would make a floor and room for someone else to disagree with you and you would value their opinion. And if you're speaking just for egocentric validation, then you're not really interested in the truth. You just need to feel good. Everybody has these moments. We all have made these mistakes, but we all have got to be honest about it so that we can communicate much better. It's very important that we do this. So in the same regard, we make some listening mistakes too. Sometimes the problem is not how we are speaking to one another. Sometimes the problem is how we are listening. Same thing. In this one, there are common causes for misunderstanding, and it is how we're filtering words. So for example, our expressive listeners, they are listening through their emotions. And that's a big problem, because if you're only focused on how certain words make you feel, you are very vulnerable to misunderstanding. Our agreeable listeners are only listening and hearing for what they agree with. And sometimes they can be very combative, because as soon as you say one little thing they disagree with, they're all over your back. You could have just used like a word the wrong way, and they're going to spend more time correcting your grammar and correcting your English than helping you to understand your point. And then also our egocentric listeners are doing the same thing. They are only filtering and listening for words that helps to boost their esteem or their ego, things that help to validate them. And they didn't hear nothing else. And we call this selective listening, but I'm just breaking down what are we selectively listening to. It's very important. So you've got to learn how to expand your capacity to take in this honest dialogue and make sure you're not making these listening mistakes, because if you are, you're not really interested in the truth yet. And it's very important. Sometimes we're more interested in being offended. Sometimes we are. We've been there, you know, there's topics we're sensitive about. But if we really want to get to change, transformation, inspiration, we've got to put our weapons down, and we put aside our opinions and perspectives and just take the time to truly listen and hear someone out, understanding their language, understanding how they're processing information, and then also understanding yourself and maybe what is missing from this conversation that we need to have, so that way you can fill in the gaps. So now that we've established, you know, who our friends are not our enemies. Our enemies are not people who are telling you the truth. Our enemies are not people who are telling you the truth in a way that you don't want to hear it. Our enemies are liars, deniers, and ignorers, okay? This is very important to know. So someone is lying to you, they're not interested in the truth. If they are a denier, they don't accept the truth. And if they are an ignorer, they don't care what the truth is. These are your only communication enemies. If they're not one of these three, they're an ally, they're a friend. You just have to learn how to talk to each other and have patience with each other through that process. Okay, so once we can see, you know, who our enemies are, then we understand who our friends are. And sometimes our friends are those leadership language people who gave us a really hard truth, or a logical people who gave us a bunch of facts that we wasn't ready to hear because we were too emotional at the time. It didn't make them an enemy. It just means they weren't talking your language at that moment. And you wouldn't be mad at someone if you found out, you know, you speak English and they speak French, and maybe they don't speak English yet. And you guys have to kind of figure out, you know, in the process, how you're going to communicate with this language barrier. It's the same thing of what's happening in our society now. You don't think of them as an enemy, and you don't think that they're wrong just because they're speaking a different language. We have to see this through the same lens in our 7 modern languages of our modern societies. They're speaking a different language, and we've got to be humble, and we have to really take the time to understand each other first. And then, you know, we can progress and start earning the right to inspire and change each other and expand one another's worldview and perspective. And so these are your enemies right here. And once you know this, they're not lying to you. They're not, you know, just denying after you're presenting everything, all the right information, or ignoring. They're a friend. They just don't know how to talk to you yet. And that's okay. You know, we all have the privilege of getting to know one another. And so that is really the end of my presentation. And there are so many people now, we're so highly offended by each other at times, and there's so much commentary that's going on. We've got these big political figures and even entertainment figures that are not afraid to step on people's toes right now. And so we have to understand why some people are offended and others are not. And it's not because they're evil people. For example, and I'm only going to speak from this from a communication perspective, with our previous president, President Trump. Some people were offended by him, some people were not. And if you go back and listen, now that you have the perspective of these 7 languages, some people were listening to him through their language. And then you can understand it. Like, I get it now. Didn't mean they agree. Sometimes that you can agree with the person. I'm sorry. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, right? But you speak each other's language, and we tend to group with people who speak our language, even if we don't agree with them. So I really hope that this was an informative presentation. It's been very important to me to have this dialogue, whether, you know, in companies, whether it's in churches, in schools. If you all know of any opportunities where I can come in and speak or just hold a discussion just like this, I'm looking for these opportunities because I really want to challenge people to learn how to speak to each other again. It just hasn't been much of a training. Everyone is so articulate and they're so smart and they can't wait to demonstrate what they know, but we're not listening enough, and we're not listening well enough with intent and patience and love and kindness. And those are really the virtues that I'm trying to teach. So please reach out to me. Again, my website is tiaramey.com. These strategies are all in my book. And thank you so much. I'm going to open it up for any questions for the next 30 seconds if anyone has any questions or comments. Let's see. Andrea says, when a person is triggered during a conversation, what is the best way to redirect? That is an excellent question. Thank you so much for asking that. One of the best ways to redirect is by asking someone, what is their objective in the discussion? What would really help me to be successful? I want to communicate with you, and it is my best intent. And I always think it's great to have an apology. I'm so sorry that I offended you. That was not my intention. I really just wanted to have some honest dialogue with you that I think could help us both. What is the best way for me to communicate with you? And is it all right for me to proceed? It's a great way to redirect it. They need to see your intent and your heart is just to connect with them. And we miss that. We miss that when someone is talking to us. They don't have to. People can totally ignore you if they want to. They could not care what you have to say, but I'm sitting here and I'm talking to you because I care. So I think that needs to be expressed. Very important. And it's also important on both sides. We're teaching our young people that we all can learn from each other here. It's so important. So thank you so much for that question, Andrea. Are there any other questions? Thank you, Coach Aaliyah, for your comment. She said, I think every living human being could benefit from this awesome training. Thank you so much for that. I'm hoping so. That is my goal. I really want to help us communicate better, because that's the only way that we get better. And that's the only way we stop making enemies of friends, people who love us. So many people have been canceled, loved ones, friends, family, and people who had great intentions, and they just didn't have the right words. They didn't know how to express it. And I think that that's so important, that we learn how to do that, and we learn to be patient with each other's process with someone learning our language. We can't just expect them to know it. Things have changed so much. Just the word gender has evolved, and we're all speaking different languages now. That word has different meanings now to different people, and we have to be patient with one another. But if there are no other questions, I want to say thank you so much for this time. It meant a lot to me that you came and you joined me in this session. I did record it, and so I will be posting this to my YouTube channel, and I will send this out to you all if you would like to share. And again, more than happy to send over. I've got some YouTube trainings as well, and some videos with some of this content, so you can find my YouTube channel on my website. Thank you all. Happy Friday, and I hope you have a great night.